moderator for this. I'm just here to sort of talk to you about whatever it is you want to talk about.
Oh, you want me to make sure that you use the mic next week? They're both on.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just shut up and you don't to do that. I mean, if I had a moderator, they'd go, okay, so tell us all about yourself, and I can do that without a moderator. So basically, I assume you're here because you have some interest in what I did, and I'm happy to answer any question you've got about what it is that I did. So I'll throw it on you. Has anybody got a question?
I want to hear the story about Jonathan Harkness.
Okay. Can you all hear the questions, or do I need to repeat them?
Please repeat.
Okay, well, he wanted to know about Jonathan Harkness, John Harkness, actually. When I was in high school, I had a history teacher that I thought was an idiot. And so one year I decided we were supposed to do a book report, and I made up the book and did a report on it. It was about a guy who rode from America back to England after he was disgusted. He was a colonialist guy, and I said that this book was written by John Harkness. I don't know where that name came from. That was my fake name. And so later, when I was doing comics, I always tried to do the best I could with whatever it was I was doing. And if I felt that the product wasn't the best I could do for whatever reason, then I didn't want to put Steve Engleheart on it. I was trying to maintain some sort of brand identity, I guess. So I would say John Harkness. And so anything that you think is mine that has that name on it basically means, I didn't feel that I was able to give it everything that I wanted to, which doesn't always translate, because I did my last Mr. Miracle overnight, and I thought, and I put John Harkness on it, but people tell me they like that story. So, you know, it is what it is. But it was basically, you know, after a while, I just felt like I wanted something with my name on it to be something I could be proud of, and if I wasn't proud of it for whatever reason. And then, when I was getting bounced out of Marvel in '89, I went from John Harkness to SFX Engleheart, which SFX means sound effects, as probably most people in this room know. That was even worse. That was like, it's just sound effects, it's not even a thing. Just to maintain some sort of consistency with, you know, with what I was doing. Yeah.
You said bounced out of Marvel in 1989. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I don't know nothing.
Well, they were, the higher ups shifted over. That was when Ron Perlman owned the company. And they came to me and they said, you know, we don't really have to pay for people who get a big salary here anymore. Spider-Man will always sell. It doesn't matter who writes it, was what they said to me. And so they said, well, we're more interested in merchandising now. And I was doing the Fantastic Four, and I had Reed and Sue get out of the Fantastic Four. So I wanted to get back to the sort of original concept of the Fantastic Four, which is like, we're just making it up as we go along here. We're not bred to be the heroes. They'd been the heroes for 30 years by that time, so it was a little difficult. But that's why I had Reed and Sue get out, so that Ben could take over. He could finally get some prestige. He could, you know, there were a number of reasons of things. And they came and they said, well, you know, we can't sell lunch boxes with Reed and Sue and Ben and Johnny if Reed and Sue are not in the book, so you have to put Reed and Sue back in. And by the way, you're also writing The Silver Surfer, and we want you to go back to one-issue stories in which he flies away at the end feeling bad. And I said, nah, that's not where I want to go. And they said, well, fine, you can be here for another 6 months and then, wrap everything up. And then actually they said with the surfer, do that one issue thing like right now. And for whatever reason, after a month or two of that, they said, okay, you can go back and finish things up. So, but to me, that's the end of the Marvel Age. I mean, there was still, Walt Simonson was still doing Beta Ray Bill, and there were still a few other things that were going on, but what I considered the Marvel Age was an age that wasn't too concerned with whether you could sell lunchboxes or not, But on the other hand, in retrospect, that's what's led to the Marvel movies and so forth, I suppose, as it became more commercialized and, tied into bigger things. I mean, I totally understand now selling lunchboxes is a useful thing to do, but it wasn't what I had come into Marvel to do, and it wasn't. Again, I've told the story a zillion times. I'm sure you've all heard it in some form or another. But I mean, when I got hired, all of us got hired in the early '70s. They said the only two things we worry about is you have to turn it in on time every month, and you have to make the book sell. And if you can do that, you can do anything else you want to do. So I had this magical situation where my first job in comics, I had complete freedom to do whatever it is I wanted to do. And, the results are the results. Those books from the 70s and 80s reflect what I thought I wanted to do without editorial interference. And as editorial interference came along, I got less interested in that. Later on, when Steve Gerber and I went to work for Malibu, the Ultraverse in the 90s, they gave us complete freedom again. And I can remember Gerber and me sitting by the pool one night at this Scottsdale retreat where we were crafting the Ultraverse and just going, wow, yeah, we were felt like the lobster or the frog in the pot. It's like we sort of gradually lost that, and whoa, here it was again, And then unfortunately, the Ultraverse went away, which was too bad on many levels.
Thank you.
Yes, you.
Can you talk a little bit about working with Julie Schwartz in DC at that time?
Yeah, Julie Schwartz, when I left Marvel the first time, in 75 or 6, somewhere in there, I left Marvel. My wife had traveled in Europe for a year before she knew me, and I thought that sounded kind of cool. Let's go to Europe for a while. And we started making arrangements to do that, and then I got a call from Jeanette Kahn saying, could you come over and write the Justice League for us? She was newly appointed, and her job was to save the company, and for whatever reason, well, they tried to hire me, and they tried to hire John Buscema, and Stan outbid her for John Buscema, but he didn't care about me. So, I said, yeah, I will do that. I also said I want to write Batman 2, which turned out to be a good idea. But I was happy with it. I enjoyed doing the Justice League. But here I was coming out of this situation where I had complete creative freedom, and Julie Schwartz was known as a very hands-on sort of editor who, in fact, would co-write the stories in many cases and so forth. I assume that I voiced that caveat to Jeanette, and I assume that she went to Julie and said, let this guy do what he wants to do. I do not know, but I do know that when I worked with Julie, it was always very smooth. He did not try to tell me what to do, and every once in a while he would have like a good suggestion. In the Detective Comics stuff where I had who do I mean?
Hugo Strange or
Ye-
Deadshot?
No, I guess it was Hugo Strange. I'm sort of blanking on who it was who ended up dead as a ghost at this point. Is that Hugo Strange? Okay. I had him beaten to death on camera. And, you know, you could watch him being beaten to death. And Julie said, you know, why don't we take that off camera? And it was a good idea. And, you know, I mean, so Julie was very, he was a good editor. And maybe he was biting his tongue half the time with me, but I mean, he let me do what I needed to do, and only improved it if, you know, if there were improvements to be made. I don't know that I have anything more about that, but I mean, he was a good guy. Julie was a good guy.
But you weren't aware about Marshall Rogers?
No, because I told Jeanette, and in fact had a time limit as to how long I could do this before I went to Europe. They originally gave me 7 issues of detective, which was how much time I had. The first couple sold well, so they threw in an 8th issue, which turned out to be nice in terms of the storytelling as it broke down. But we started out with Walt Simonson and Al Milgrom doing the art on it. And this was in an era when it was inconceivable to go and say, I want somebody else. First of all, why would I say that about Walt and Milgrom? But second of all, you know, it just would never have occurred to me to do that. But somehow or other, and I don't know the ins and out of it, Terry Austin would be probably the only one who knows, they decided to shift. But by that time, one of the things I think might have been the problem was that by doing it Marvel style, which was like Marvel style was you would tell the story to the artist, just like, here's the story. And then you can figure out how best to draw that, which I preferred. I like to have the artists have as much freedom as possible. But that meant Walt had to, you know, figure out what it was, and then it had to go get inked, and somehow or other it was taking too long, perhaps, I'm not sure. In any event, I shifted over for the first time in my life at that point to writing full scripts, which I never, you know, hadn't done, and I did find that it was useful because I could really pace the atmosphere and so forth. That was good. But I wrote all these scripts all the way to the end, and then left the country as I ran out of time, left the country. And so I did not know who was going to draw it. And considering where DC was in those days, where Neil Adams and Gil Kane and Bob Brown and other people had all gone to Marvel, the odds were that it was going to be, you know, Joe Journeyman and Bill Hack, you know, doing this. And I've said, you know, over the years, if that had been the case, the scripts would have been exactly the same, but you wouldn't have liked them as much. You would have said, you know, because you get the overall impression out of a comic. Most people don't like figure the script and the art and separate the two in their head. So I went to Europe, and we traveled around all summer and spent the winter in Mallorca. And one day I got this package from the States, and it was all of the issues done by Marshall and Terry. And quite literally, something to tell you on Easter, but I mean, I said, thank God, you know, I was like, it was so good, you know, as we all agree, it was fabulous, but it was the first time I was seeing it, and the fact that they loved the Batman as much as I loved the Batman, and gave me the visuals that I would have liked to have had. That was great, you know. So I didn't meet Marshall and Terry till I came back from Europe, and we became obviously friends after that, and did work together after that. But and I will say, I didn't know this until we did the Dark Detective stuff in the 2000s. I heard for the first time that when Marshall was doing this art, DC hated it. He would come in every month, and Joe Orlando would yell at him that this was not the DC way to do things, this is not the thing to do. Terry tells me that he would sit outside the office hearing this for half an hour, and then Marshall would come out white-faced from having been through all this. So exactly how they decided, those two guys decided to keep doing what they were doing, even though DC didn't like it, is a story, that Marshall is not gonna tell you, but maybe Terry will tell you someday. Yes,
Well, I can add PS to that.
okay,
I was working with DC at that time,
okay,
and I don't know about Joe, but other people in the office loved it.
Mhm.
So it wasn't just DC didn't like Marshall's artwork. Some people did and some people didn't.
yeah, I guess that's probably
And
usual.
it was, I mean, the guys in the production department,
Yeah,
they were really wowed by it.
yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, DC had a house style, right? I mean, there was an overall style to DC stuff, and
no, I know what
here's,
you're saying, but it wasn't unanimous.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the whole thing is improbable in many ways that it came out the way it did, but, that's where, the laughing fish and all that came from. Okay? Yeah.
How did Coyote come about?
I grew up in Indiana. I went east to college. I worked in New York. And in the summer of '73, I flew out to Las Vegas, where Alan Weiss, a name that probably doesn't mean much to most people, but he was around. He was one of the young guys, a bunch of us young guys who all showed up at the same time in New York. That's where he was from. And I spent a month living with him in his house, which made Vegas to me a place where people live, not the Strip, right? My wife hates Vegas, just hates Vegas, and cannot see it as anything other than people losing their money to the casinos. But had a great time in Vegas, and since Alan had grown up there, he knew all the desert places around Vegas to go, and so we would go out and go to places which now actually are national parks and Calico Basin, and for people who know anything about Vegas. And so the day before I went to Vegas, I was back in Indiana, and we went out to some farm and were climbing around in cherry trees, plucking cherries out of these trees. And the next day I flew to Vegas, and I'm like, Jesus, there's nothing here. This is, desert. But after spending a month there with a person who grew up there, I began to see really the desert as a beautiful thing, which I still consider. I love the desert now. And it was just, coyote stories were part of that ambiance. And so the idea was to, I had the idea. It wasn't for another couple of years that that I turned it into something from there. But I liked the desert is primitive in many respects. It's, it's not full of trees, full of cherries. It's got, it's much more down to earth, so to speak. And I wanted to do something with that ambiance. And that was the next time actually that I worked with Marshall, doing Coyote originally. And later I would just say, when I was doing the book for Epic for Marvel, after we got started with Steve Aloha, and then that fell apart, and then I ended up with Chaz Truog, whose art I just loved, because it was primitive too. I mean, he's really a good artist if you look at how he does things, but he has this really sort of style that reminded me of like totem poles and things. I mean, it's but a lot of people didn't like it, which is, a thing. As somebody said at the time, George Perez was the guy at the time, which is obviously a completely different approach. So we ran Coyote as long as we could, and then it went away. But Yeah, it was the desert. It was just me discovering something and wanting to do something with it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Chaz, because I loved his artwork. I thought it was absolutely amazing.
Mm. Yes.
One of your characters that you created for Batman, Silver St. Cloud, she's kind of in limbo because the last time we saw her, her throat was slit in a cliffhanger for a story that was never resolved. You've
Okay.
gone back to Silver a few times in different miniseries. Would
Right.
you be interested in resolving the cliffhanger, maybe showing that she's all right, or returning to her?
Well, the actual true answer to that is I don't want to give DC any more Batman stuff that they can strip mine for the movies. Every Batman story that I've done for them, parts of it have ended up in Christopher Nolan films or someplace. And in fact, when they got to Detective 1000 or whatever that thing was, they wanted me to come and do a story with Neil Adams. That, you know, I would write a story with Neil, and Neil gave me my first break in this business, and it was a dream of mine all along to do a story with Neil. And I sat down to write Batman, and I just couldn't do it. It's like, no, I can't do this for DC anymore. DC is not a good company to work for, in my opinion, for freelancers. There's another thing going on right now with Guy Gardner. Guy Gardner's going to be in the first Superman movie from James Gunn. Joe Staten and I have never gotten a dime for Guy Gardner. They won't give us credit for that, so I'm not a fan of theirs. So the answer to your question is no, but I wanted him, Bruce Wayne, I wanted to see the person inside the costume. I had a number of things I wanted to do with the Batman. One was to bring back the pulp atmosphere and the homicidal Joker and that sort of thing, but I also wanted to get more into who this guy is. And it seemed to me, this was something I'd had in the back of my mind for a long time, but when I was a kid and I'd read comics and Lois Lane would snuggle up to Superman and he'd get embarrassed, I'd go, I don't think adults act like that, you know? It was the child's mentality of comics coming through rather than a real guy. So I really wanted Batman to be a grown-up person, and it seemed to me that have a grown-up person, he would have a girlfriend, and if it was gonna be a girlfriend, she was gonna be probably as strong as he was, able to stand up to a guy like that. And so all of that led to Silver St. Cloud. When they asked us to do the second run in 2000, I came back to that, and then I wrote the third series, which has never been published, where there's, it continues the story of Bruce and Silver in there. That third series, by the way, has never been published, because Marshall died after he did, like, the pencils for the first issue. And according to Terry Austin again, DC said, good, that gives us an excuse not to publish this. DC, once I started making it clear that I was not happy about the fact that our stuff was being taken and put into the movie without any credit or anything, DC doesn't like that response from their freelancers, and so they didn't want to do the third one. And as I said, they said this gives us an excuse. But on my website, which is steveengleheart.com, if you go and look, I have a list of everything that I ever did, and if you go look for Dark Detective 3, which is what I call it, you can download for free a digital comic, which is basically all of the Dark Detective material to that point, and then the 6 scripts and the artwork, Marshall's artwork for the first issue. And then there's a guy in Finland who drew the second issue in Marshall's style. And then the last 4 scripts have no art to go with them. But that story does exist if you're interested in getting that. As I say, free download if you want to do that. I like it's not that I need to have Batman in a romance, but I needed to have Bruce Wayne be human, you know? Because again, to me, Batman is not a robot or you know, that sort of thing. He's a guy who's pushed himself as far as he can go, and he knows that if he went one step farther, he'd go over the edge. But that's the difference between him and the Joker, that he is as intense as he can get, but he's not gonna lose it. And to me, that's the dichotomy of the whole Batman Joker thing. And the Joker lost it a long time ago. And the difference between those two, between this human guy who has no superpowers, he's just doing the best he can, devoted to this whole thing, versus the complete lunatic. I mean, that to me is the essence of Batman. And there was a book that came out recently with a lot of essays on the Joker, and the one I contributed said it was time to kill the Joker. Because every story since we did that sort of thing has there, not every story, but there's been a lot of stories about Batman and a homicidal Joker, and I thought, could you make the Penguin into somebody useful? Could you make any of those guys into somebody who might challenge the Joker? Because otherwise it's like the Joker's here and all the rest of them are down here. Anyway, that's a long answer about Silver St. Cloud, but I like strong women. I mean, when I took over the Avengers, somebody said the whole deal with the Scarlet Witch is she does a hex and then she falls down exhausted. And I thought, that's an Avenger? How is that? You know, so I'm Mockingbird, Kat Matui, all those people. I like strong women. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the Point Man?
Yeah, the Point Man. That was when I came back from Europe, and I thought I was done with comics. I had left Marvel, had done my DC stuff, and thought, okay, because I never thought I was going to write Batman. I never thought I was going to work for DC. And having written Batman and the Justice League, I thought, well, okay, I'll go do something else. And so I wanted to write a novel. We had a panel a couple days ago about writing. I don't know if any of you were there for that, but what I discovered with that is I thought to myself, okay, so here's a comic book story. A novel is going to be this much longer. What I didn't understand was it's also this much taller, and it's exponentially that much more. There's that much more stuff that has to connect. So I was learning how to write a novel when I was doing that, but it was set in what was contemporary San Francisco, 1980. My hero was an AM disc jockey. The Russians were the bad guys. Over the years, that whole Russians is the bad guys thing went away, and then it came back again. And when I did The Long Man, whatever, I did 3 more of them, right, in the late 2000s. Long, Arena, and I forget. But anyway, in The Point Man, he was dealing with a wizard who had been alive for a long time. There's lots of wizards who were alive for a long time, but that was my shot at it. And so in the later books, he had become somebody who could be alive for a long time. And I found it really interesting to write this guy and say, okay, he was an AM disc jockey in 1980. Now he is, a different, life has moved on. Now it's 2007 or whatever it was when I wrote those books, started writing those books. But it was interesting. People say, oh, I've been alive since Ben Franklin. But it was interesting to see this guy actually do that, to actually be alive over a period of time. And that's what I really liked about the 3 books that I wrote, but can't quite remember the name of. In the later stuff. Does that answer your question, or was there more? Yeah.
Speaking of,
That's all right, go ahead.
Ben Franklin. remember right when you left Marvel, you were writing Doctor Strange,
Right.
and Doctor Strange went into the past, and it seemed like Clea kind of had a little thing with Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah,
And I think you left right in the middle of the story.
I did, yes, I did.
I just wonder if you might share, like, where you thought the story might have gone, if you would continue it.
Well, again, speaking of strong women, Doctor Strange was sort of ignoring Clea a lot, saving the world and the universe and all that stuff. But she was getting tired of it. And Ben Franklin was said to be quite someone with the ladies. So I thought, okay, let's do that. And the thing about where I would have gone is always a question, because I tended to write organically. I would, I mean, it wasn't like every month I'd be a total blank slate, but I would do things. I used to call it throwing plates up in the air. I would do things in stories that I didn't really know how this thing was gonna play out, but it sounded cool to see where it would go. And so then when I would get to the place where, okay, that plate's about to come down, it better come down because it's been up there for a while, whatever, then I would figure out what that plate meant, what that was about. And so with all my series, when I leave, particularly if I leave abruptly, I really don't have much to say about where they would have gone. I mean, that particular story was tied into the birth, in 1776, the birth of America and so forth. This was for 1976, the bicentennial, and so the villain in that, Stigero, I think, was basically drawing his energy from the kind of patriotic fervor of everything, and he would have still been alive in 1976, and we would have resolved that particular villain story with that. Obviously, Ben Franklin was not going to be there in 1976, but I would think, my theory was that Clea was pissed off, that she was being ignored a lot, being a princess and all, and Strange was going to have to remember that he was a human being, that he, and she was, I guess, a human being, I'm not sure. So that, I was doing romance again. I mean, I've done a lot of romance amongst my superhero stuff, and that was, makes people more human, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you create Dr. Philosophus, is that his name? That glowing reading guy?
Dr. Phosphorus,
Yeah, that's what I meant.
what's the question?
Oh, okay, so was he the same character that was in Batman Beyond? They renamed him Blight. Was that the same character basis?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, if they could certainly have retconned it or said that he was or something, but I don't know that. I mean, Dr. Phosphorus was my creation, and what happened after that, I don't really know.
I thought that connection had some kind of connection with Batman Beyond.
Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to ask the guys who did that. That one I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, so, you co-plotted a couple of Doctor Strange with Frank Bruner.
Yeah.
What'd you guys do, like get on the phone and map it out?
No, I lived in Connecticut at the time, and he lived in Manhattan. And so it was a bi-monthly book in the beginning, and every 2 months, either he would come to Connecticut or I would come to New York. We would have dinner, just sort of schmooze for a while, and then later on in the evening, we would sit down, and I would say, here's where I think I'd like to go with this book this time. And he would say, here's what I wanted to do this time. Frank was, I've always said, we did that book together. He had ideas. I do not mean to denigrate artists in any way, but a lot of artists are just happy to draw. That's what they do. But Frank wanted to be involved in the story as well, and I was happy to do that. So I'd have some ideas, he'd have some ideas, and then it was my job as the writer to come up with some coherent way to put those things together. And sometimes it took till 3 or 4 in the morning before we could kind of figure out how we could both be satisfied with where we were going with this. But that's how we did that book. Frank was one of those artists that's kind of slow. So when the book was popular enough to go monthly, he couldn't keep up with it. And so eventually I switched over to Gene Colan. Colan's one of those guys who just wanted to draw. I mean, I said to him, you can contribute to this if you want. And he's like, no, I don't, I just want to draw it. And I love Runner, and that stuff that we did together, I'm really, really, really happy with. But sometimes it sort of puts Gene Colan as being in a secondary position, and Gene Colan not to be in a secondary position. So even though that was just me plotting it after that with Gene, I want to make sure that we don't forget about Gene's run on that thing. Yeah. That was where Ben Franklin and Clea got together. And Gene's run. Yes.
You were part of actually, literally a part of the company crossover comics between Marvel and DC. About the Vermont Halloween parade.
Yeah. The question was about the first crossover between companies, right? There's a town in Vermont called Rutland, and the guy who was somehow in charge of the Halloween festivities in Rutland had a parade every year, and he was really into comics, and so he encouraged the kids to do comic costumes. And people in New York doing comics heard about this, and so a couple people, Bernie Wrightson, Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil, went up and spent Halloween in Rutland and came back and said, it's really fun, it's really, this was a good thing. So the next year, Len Wein, Jerry Conway, Len's then wife, Glynis, and I went up there. And when we were up there, we were having a good time. Halloween in Vermont is cool, a lot of bare trees, full moon, all this kind of stuff, chill in the air. And we just started talking about a story, and we had this idea, and I think it was probably mine, because I think, I tend to think more outside the box maybe than Len and Jerry did or do, but that might be ego talking, I don't know. Anyway, the idea was, could we do a thing where the three of us could each write one of our books and tie it together? And two of us were working for Marvel, but one of us was working for DC. And so the idea was, could we do that? Could we somehow not get shut down by the companies trying to do that? And so me at the bottom of the totem pole with the Beast, and Jerry with Thor, and Len with the Justice League, we did work that out. And if you take those three books and put them in the right order, you can see Len and Jerry and Glynis and Steve wander through each of those stories. We come in, we go out, and then in the other story we come in and we go out, and then in the next story we come in and go out. I was writing the Beast, that was like my first superhero thing. I mean, it was like incredible hubris for me to think, sure, let's do something that involves Thor and the Justice League and companies and all that kind of stuff. And then, were you asking about Mantis as well, or no? Huh? I can't hear you.
I said no, but that doesn't mean I don't want to hear about it.
Okay. Well, when I went over to DC then, when I left Marvel, I was actually at the San Diego show that year, and somebody said to me, does that mean we're not gonna see Mantis anymore? Which to me was a challenge. It's like, oh yeah, let's see if we can do that. So then I put her in the Justice League, she had to have another name. She looked different, but she has all this cryptic dialogue, which, you know, I can't tell you who I am because the lawyers would be upset or something, something along those lines. Again, to me, comics were comics, and I understood that Marvel and DC were not the same company and all the rest of that stuff, but I had complete creative freedom. So I thought, well, you know, let's see if we can make this happen. A lot of stuff that I do is like a challenge to myself. Can I do something here that isn't obvious, or, you know, or whatever. So yeah, she, you know, and now, of course, in her third incarnation, she's in the Guardians movies, where she's a completely different character, other than the name and the fact that they're both female. There is no overlap between the comic book Mantis and the movie Mantis. I, however, really like the Guardians movies. I really like the Mantis in the movies. But not the same character that I nurtured for a long time. When I first met Palm Clementieff in a convention, the first thing she said to me was, "I understand you don't like my Mantis." I like your Mantis. It's just not, you know, not the one that I do. So, yeah.
When you were writing Detective, and I know you're working ahead, were you reading other DC books at the time?
Yeah.
I think there was a great sense of continuity, like, I know I mean, you referenced Robin's time with the Teen Titans.
Yeah.
Maybe England was in Batman like a couple months earlier.
Well, see, I'm old school in that way, in that I believed in continuity. I believed in continuity longer than a lot of people, and got harassed for it. And I do understand now that referring you back to Fantastic Four number 14 does, you know, that's not actually going to happen. But when I started, it was only 10 years in to the Marvel Universe, and so I was writing the same Thor, the same Captain America, the same Iron Man that Stan Lee had written and Roy Thomas had written, and so forth. Nobody been retconned or volume 2'd or any of that kind of stuff to that point. So when I went to DC, I tried to do the same thing. I tried to make it fit in. DC was not nearly as, they didn't care so much about continuity. It was kind of something that I thought was useful, but I don't know that DC much cared. But yeah, I mean, I used the Robin that existed at that point. I used, you know, the other books that existed, the other continuities that existed at that point. Again, at Marvel in the 70s and in the 80s, when we were all in charge of our own books, really, it was all very collegial. If I wanted to use somebody else's character, I would go to them and I'd say, I want to use this character. I've got a story that this would fit into, and how can we work that out? And vice versa, they would come to me if they wanted to do that. And so we'd work it out, you know. It wasn't editorially mandated or editorially blocked. It was just like, we're both doing comics here. How can we, you know, get Daredevil to come over for an issue or that kind of thing? Yeah,
Justice League origin alone was amazing. It was retro, but it's like, here's where Green Arrow was in 1959.
Well, that one, yeah.
And I mean, in 1977 as a kid, you had no, you know, concept. You'd never read those issues.
Right.
But it was just so cool to tie everything together and to have that kind of history and connection with characters.
Well, see, yeah, I do like that kind of thing. It didn't mean that much at DC, really. But I saw this, you know, and because whenever I would take over a book, I would go back. I had a collection. I was a fan before I was a pro, so I'd collected all this stuff, and I'd go back and I'd read all the Justice Leagues, you know, or whatever, and look for things. Here's an idea that didn't get developed. Here's a concept that occurs to me by reading this. Any of that kind of stuff that I could base on what had happened, if because I liked continuity of things. And I don't remember what it is now, but there was some discrepancy in how the storyline of how the Justice League developed based against other stories that were happening at the time. And I was working with Dick Dillon on the Justice League, which, you know, again, talking about Gene Colan before, you know, many people are aware of me and Marshall Rogers on the Batman. Not so many people, you know, I mean, it worked, but people forget me and Dick Dillon on the Justice League. But I loved working with Dick Dillon. He was old school, and that was cool, because I like the continuity of things. And so all that came together, and he was famous for the Blackhawks, and the Blackhawks were, you know, big in the 50s, and you know, then being the kind of anal person that I am, I needed Rex the Wonder Dog and you know, the Martian Manhunter from those eras, and so on and so forth. Again, just trying to have fun. I mean, because again, what Jeanette said when she asked me to come over was, she said, I want you to do for the Justice League what you did for the Avengers. Give them personalities, have a story. And I said to her, if I have to like flesh out everybody in the Justice League and tell a story, I can't do that in a normal 17-page comic, which is what it was at the time. So I'm gonna need 34 pages a month. There are many artists who would say, well, I'm not doing that. But Dylan, you know, he was old school, so it's like, sure, I'll do that. And so I had then the space to do that. I will jump ahead. In 2001, Marvel came to me and said, we want to bring the Malibu characters into the Marvel Universe, and we'd like you to do that. And I said the same thing, that if you want me to bring in all these characters and introduce them and tell a story, I'm going to need a double-sized book. And they said, and I said, it's like when I did it with Dick Dillon, and they said, there is no artist today that fans like who can draw 34 pages a month, and there's no artist today who can draw 34 pages a month that fans like. And then that whole project, that died for other complicated reasons. Yeah.
I got a question. What was it like working with Frank Robbins?
What about Frank Robbins?
What was it like working with him?
Well, Frank Robbins had a very unique style, and I liked his style in and of itself. I wasn't real thrilled because he didn't look like Sal Buscema at all. And when we were in the middle of the whole Nomad thing and switched from Sal to Frank, that was a rough transition. It didn't, artistically, it was very rough, and in terms of trying to tell this ongoing story of the Nomad, you know, I just sort of, again, kind of like I said with the Batman scripts, I mean, I wrote the best thing I could do, and then hoped that people would go for it. But there was a lot of upset, I think, you know, because Sal had drawn that book as long as I've been writing it, and
It even looked weird to me when I was 10 years old.
yeah, it is. He was weird, but it was a cool style, I thought. If you ever read Man Bat or any of those things, you know,
I just
it
thought
was.
better on Invaders than on Captain America. His style fit Invaders.
Yeah,
Because he had the 40s, it had that old nostalgic feel to it.
yeah.
When he did Invaders, but
Well,
when
he
did
came from the
modern
Milton
Captain
Caniff
America,
school,
it
right? I
got
mean,
weird.
the Terry and the Pirates, Steve Canyon stuff. He was one of those guys who had that, all the dark, all the blacks, all that stuff. Yeah.
I gotta ask, how fun was it writing Chip in the Green Lantern Corps comic?
It was fun. When I took over Green Lantern from Len Wein and Dave Harper, Dave
Gibbons.
Yeah. John Stewart was the Green Lantern, but everybody said, well, of course Hal will come back.
Yeah.
And I agreed. I liked Hal. I wanted him to come back. But I thought, why does that mean that John Stewart has to leave? why can't there be 2 of them? Which then led me to say, why can't there be 3 of them? And then I said, why can't we have a core of them? Because over the years, all those other guys, I created Kilowog, but Salak and Chip and Arisia had been created previously in the Green Lantern mythos, doing continuity stuff again. So I basically just cherry-picked the ones that I thought would make a cool team. And having a cartoon chipmunk Green Lantern was cool, you know? And Salak was very serious all the time, you know? And Arisia had her arc where she decided to grow up and be Hal Jordan's girlfriend. And then, of course, Guy Gardner, for whom I do not get paid, came out of that as well. I love the whole Green Lantern mythos. I mean, it was, I would say Batman is my favorite, probably ongoing comic book character. I mean, I wrote all these other guys, and I'm happy with Captain America and Doctor Strange and all these other people, but Batman is Batman. But the second ranking book at DC, as far as I was concerned, was Green Lantern, and so I was very happy to get that. And there's just so much mythos to play with in there, which is why I was so pissed off at the movie. Most people were like unhappy with the movie, but I was pissed off because I knew what all you could do with that, and it didn't involve 20 minutes of flying a jet plane. You know, it's like let's get onto the cool stuff. And then we had stories that sort of focused on each individual guy as they went along, and Chip and his little cartoon world that he came from and all that. That was fun.
Mickey Mouse gloves,
Yeah, 3 fingers. Yeah.
Do you have any backstory behind the decision for Beast going blue and furry?
Yeah. The X-Men was a failed book, right? It had Steranko on it. It had Neil Adams on it. But my theory on the X-Men it debuted the same month as the Avengers, and they were both bi-monthly to start with. And pretty soon the Avengers went monthly, but X-Men didn't. And I think that sort of settled into people's minds that the X-Men was a second-level book somehow. And so they tried everything they could. I mean, Roy Thomas and Neil Adams doing it at the end, it was great, but it still failed, right? It went out of business, and so when I got there, they were thinking, because comic book characters never go away, they always come back, if for no other reason than copyright reasons, right? You got to publish them every once in a while, or you lose your copyright. So Roy and Jerry Conway had this idea, maybe if we just take one X-Man and see if we can make that work, and which one should we take? Well, Werewolf by Night and Dracula and The Mummy and all those are doing well for us right now. We're having a nice boom with these monster books. So if we made the Beast look more like a werewolf, we could do that. And so then they gave him gray fur. But stop now or in 15 minutes?
No, it's past 20 after already.
Oh, all right. Okay, that went fast. So Roy, as the editor-in-chief, had this idea, like that's why the Submariner put on black leather, because the idea is Submariner's not one of the top Marvel stars, and it's probably because he's pink. So let's put on black leather and he'll look cooler. And it was the same then with the Beast's fur color. It's like, we make the fur darker, maybe that will be the thing to do, you know. I guess we're out of time. I'm surprised that went fast. I'm going to get out of here in about an hour because I got a plane to catch, but if you have more questions, I'll be back down at my table.